The beginning of the story begins with a fiery sword piercing the stone floor, which was able to break it into several pieces. So the strongest. Aizawa Yuri controlled this patterned weapon so that it could throw away several multicolored monsters reaching towards him with a golden shock wave. Yuri's gaze was emotionless as dust rose around him. That's why you're always alone. The ominous god had several paws on which were red luminous spikes. There were several eyes on his head and red smoke coming out of his mouth. The monster screams, "He's a fool!" The sinister god ordered Yuri to answer his question. He loudly asked him for what purpose he came here. Yuri's face showed displeasure as he stood with his back to this monster. Without moving his head, he glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. Yuri's blue eyes sparkled as white smoke flew nearby. The sinister god shouted, asking him why he killed his brothers. At the same time, he opened his mouth wide, the pupils of his eyes disappeared and he began to attack him. Red tentacles loomed menacingly over Yuri as he wondered what his purpose was. Yuri's weapon shone brightly in yellow and without warning, he cut its many tentacles in an instant so that after Yuri's attack, the weapon left behind a golden trail of movements of it. The monster pulled out his long tongue to the side, and pain was reflected in his eyes. Yuri calmly answered him that there was no point in answering the questions of someone who would soon die. The sinister god looked straight at him with confidence and began shouting for this monster to die already. He began to attack him even harder and faster with his tentacles, trying to cling directly to his body. Yuri took a defensive stance and prepared his weapon for attack. Sometimes power breeds absolute loneliness. He is called the sinister god. Yuri climbed onto one of its tentacles with great speed and is trying to get closer to the monster with lightning speed, running and jumping over its large tentacles. Yuri thought that this monster at least understood him. As soon as he got closer to his body, I jumped back, trying to attack him. Hanging from above was not only his sword, but also many others that were aimed at the body of the ominous god. The sword stuck right in the middle of this monster's skull. The sinister god raised several eyes to Yuri and opened his mouth wide. Yuri said that if only he could live peacefully in his next life. The ominous god only had time to look at him. After a short amount of time, Yuri fell to the ground at high speed, simultaneously cutting the monster's body in half with the help of his magic-charged sword. This sinister god only managed to fill the space with his scream one last time. His body suddenly darkened and he began to gradually develop blue smoke. This smoke began to gather in one place and transform into something. The smoke turned into a blue shining crystal. It gradually began to fall into Yuri's hands, who raised one hand up to receive it. In his hands was a demonic crystal for rebirth into a new life. It had a rank of SSS. Yuri thought that he could finally get it. The crystal in his hands began to illuminate everything around more and more until it completely turned into a single blue circle. Yuri did not take his eyes off what was happening and thought that he would become free. Then he closed his eyes, waiting for the moment. Yuri imagined that he would go to the distant future, and so he was reborn. He had already lived 3 lives, when in the first life he was a businessman who nervously looked at his watch while talking on the phone. He was also a powerful magician during his first life. In his second life, he had a strong sword and powerful equipment. Yuri was the strongest magical swordsman, and now he became an adventurer with a rank of F. He imagined himself lying relaxed on the grass and looking at the blue sky with clouds. As soon as something blocked the light of the sun that fell on his face, Yuri opened one eye to see what it was. A joyful Anya loomed in front of him, next to whom was a satisfied Lime, and behind them stood a red-haired girl. Yuri smiled weakly at them, and then stood up from the grass, leaning on his knees. There were people in front of him who expressed joy towards him. He believed that his life would finally become worthy. At that time, Yuri had his eyes closed, and as the power passed through him, he opened his eyes. He found himself in a large, dark cave. Yuri sat down on the stone floor and wondered where he was. A blue intermittent ribbon of smoke flew off his body. Yuri silently looked at his hands, which he was examining carefully. He looked at it in surprise and asked who he was. A system window popped up in front of Yuri, asking Aizawa Yuri to open the status window. He made a puzzled sound as he looked at the glowing system window in front of him. Yuri noticed the name, Aizawa Yuri. He looked carefully and wondered, is this his name? Suddenly, small clawed feet stepped next to him and Yuri drew attention to it. A D-rank elite goblin and an E-rank goblin drew the attention of him. It was with its weapon at the ready, growling menacingly in place and chuckling lightly. Suddenly, Yuri was surrounded by many goblins from all sides. He looked around at it and asked, "What is this?" Yuri paid attention to the question that was asked in his direction by one of the goblins. "The bastard, what is he doing here?" A huge goblin with a crown on his head stood in front of him. He asked, "Is the person on their territory?" In front of him was a goblin lord who was rank B. He exhaled hot air from his mouth intimidatingly. Yuri thought about it, wondering what he was doing here. He raised his head up and told him that he didn't know what he was doing here. The goblin lord laughed very loudly throughout the cave and told him that he did not need to lie. He asked with interest, "Is he a spy from the Adventurers Guild?" It's too late for him to start being afraid. The goblin lord then pointed his hand at Yuri for his goblin subordinates to attack him. He ordered them not to let him get away from here. A group of goblins rushed towards him. Yuri looked at this whole situation indifferently and thought that he was giving up and why this always happens to him. He looked back and noticed a stick lying on the stone floor. Immediately memories from a past life came to him, and he was surprised and asked what it was. Yuri quickly jumped from one place to another to confidently grab the stick. He looked back in surprise and thought that his body was acting on its own. Swinging strongly, he struck the goblin with his stick. All the goblins around him were stunned at the sight of it, and it tried to jump away from that place. The goblin lord shouted to his subordinates not to be afraid. "It's just one person. He must be killed immediately." A group of goblins began to attack Yuri again, brandishing simple weapons. Yuri stood still and continued to hold the stick in his hands. Suddenly he made a sudden movement with this stick. At that same moment, the entire group of goblins attacking him was defeated. Yuri thought that this stick reminded him of the past. He stood in front of the goblin lord, who was stunned by his skills. Yuri looked at the stick and a system window popped up next to him warning that the sword mastery skill, initial class, had been obtained. Then the middle grade sword skill was obtained. He obtained the highest grade swordsmanship skill. Yuri thought that everything was clear to him. That's because in his past life he was the strongest sword master. His image was great, as he calmly looked forward and leaned his body on his sword. Yuri understood that as soon as a weapon fell into his hands, his body began to move on its own, remembering all his actions from his past life. Meanwhile, the goblin lord opened his mouth wide and fire magic began to gather there. He shouted that this pathetic man should not think that he was better than them. Now he is finished. The goblin lord summoned a magical skill, Firestorm. A large fire tornado headed towards Yuri. The goblin lord grinned and said that he had the skill of a sword master, but it was no match for his magic. Meanwhile, clouds of smoke flew out of his mouth. He looked ahead and saw the silhouette of a man through large clouds of dust. The goblin lord made a puzzled sound. Yuri stood straight and extended his hand, fingers spread. Behind him was a system window that said that the fire magic skill, initial class, had been obtained. Then he received the middle class fire magic skill. The skill of fire magic, the highest class, was obtained. The goblin lord shouted in surprise asking, "What? What kind of creature is he? He definitely hit him, then why is he still alive?" The goblin lord looked very scared. A fireball was forming towards Yuri's hand. Behind this ball his cold gaze was visible. Yuri calmly said the skill, Firestorm. A large fire tornado appeared from his hand, causing the goblin lord to scream very loudly. Yuri remained confident in his stance while Firestorm dealt enormous damage to the monster. While he was standing in a pose, he thought, amazingly, he had another life. This life was even before the one in which he was a swordsman. He was an archmage. A green robe and a magic staff were his equipment and weapons. Yuri looked at the system window, which wrote his name, Aizawa Yuri, and his innate abilities were the memory of magic and the memory of swordsmanship. His abilities, sword skill, are top class. The memory of magic had an SSS rank. Because of this, the speed of obtaining magical abilities is increased by 100 times. Memory of sword mastery with SSS rank. Also because of this, the speed of acquiring sword skills has been increased by 100 times. Yuri said in his mind, he was reborn for the third time. In his first life, he worked for unscrupulous Japanese corporations, and he was an archmage for the first time. The second time he became a sword master, and now the third time. Yuri looked at his hands while the fire burned around him. This time he thought that he was excellent with sword and magic and remembered this skill. Yuri peered into his hands until a picture of a memory appeared before his eyes, of people begging him for help, because he could help them. The other part of the people then watched as he sat on the mountain of the opponents he had struck, and shouted in fear that he was too strong. He is a monster. Yuri began to climb out of the cave through a huge hole in it. He walked and thought in his head that he had already tried to open up to this disgusting world. Sunlight streamed into his eyes as he climbed out of the cave. Yuri opened his eyes wide as the sun shone brightly in front of him between two green hills. He stood there stunned and thought that he had been reborn. He was tired of living for others. Yuri put his hand to his throat and thought relaxedly that this time he would live only for himself. He climbed down from a large rock and was now between the trees. He placed all his items in front of him and thought that he had some money, food, and even a rusty sword, although that was all he had. Yuri sat on a log and looked thoughtfully at all his objects, saying that this was better than nothing at all. He picked up the rusty sword and looked at it appraisingly, thinking that for the first time this would be enough, and this weapon was no different from that stick. A system window suddenly popped up in front of him, notifying him that the skill, analysis, had been acquired. Yuri made a puzzled sound and wondered, another skill? His eyes became clouded and a magic circle was visible in them. He looked forward in surprise. There was a sword in front of his eyes, and the system windows told him that it was an iron sword that had AD rank, and it was also of terrible quality. This is rated G in condition and is not fit for use at all. He looked at the objects lying in front of him and system windows popped up above them, telling him that in front of him was a bag of gold, rank F with 8 pieces, and this was called a small amount. 2 bags of F rank jerky, of which there were 7 in total. This is dried animal meat. Yuri said that now everything is clear to him, and with the help of this he can find out information about the object, which is quite convenient. He looked around and thought that, however, he did not know where he was and it would be good for him to meet someone. He looked forward thoughtfully, while a rustling sound was heard behind the bushes. Yuri turned around and asked, "Are these goblins again?" Lime jumped out in front of him and squeaked very happily. Yuri watched him silently, while Lime happily continued to squeak while looking at him. Yuri let out a relaxed breath and thought that it doesn't seem to be hostile towards him, so he doesn't want to kill it just like that. Lime became interested in the bag and his eyes shone. It squeaked enthusiastically. Yuri made a puzzled sound and wondered if it wanted to eat. If he asks for it, then here's food for him, let him eat. He handed him a piece of jerky and Lime squealed in delight. It happily ate a large piece of meat while Yuri watched it all. Suddenly new system windows appeared in front of him and he noticed it. In this it was written that the taming skill, the initial class, had been obtained. He acquired the skill of taming, the middle class. He also acquired a top class taming skill. He now has a skill, taming, the highest class, rank B. This skill allows you to tame various monsters. Yuri asked, puzzled, taming? Lime pushed his leg and squeaked contentedly. Yuri silently watched all this, because he understood, because with the help of this skill he can communicate with monsters. He stroked Lime contentedly. Yuri thought about it, and wondered if maybe his skill acquisition depends on what he does. Suddenly, a loud scream came from the forest, and Yuri was surprised to be distracted by it. From the side, he saw the silhouette of someone who had recently shouted, "Someone! Let them help him." It was a male Poncho Panza and his race was lycanthrope. His age reaches 32 years. Yuri silently watched this and thought, this is the one he wanted to meet. He rushed past Lime and it squeaked in confusion. Yuri ran up to Panza and asked him, can he distract him for a minute? Panza, with a tear-stained face, shouted in puzzlement. He wondered in surprise, who else was he? Where did he come from? Yuri told him that he wanted to ask him something. Panza answered him in fear that he had no time for him now. Yuri asked him in surprise, is he busy with something? Panza looked behind him and screamed in fear about something. A huge bird with the head of a rooster flew behind them and Panza shouted at him to look around. Yuri saw this bird above them. It was a basilisk, with rank B. It screamed loudly. Yuri looked back at this with confidence. The basilisk began to sharply descend to the ground trying to attack them. Yuri continued to look at the bird and wondered if he killed it, would it answer his questions? Panza joyfully shouted that he would answer all his questions, whatever he wanted. He promised this so that only he could be helped. Yuri looked confidently at the bird again, grabbed his weapon and stopped abruptly with one leg. The basilisk opened its beak wide and was preparing to attack, while Yuri stood with his weapon at the ready. Yuri thought that this sword would hardly be enough to cope with this monster, and for this he would try to put some of its magic into the blade. He put his hand to the weapon and it glowed blue. Yuri ran his hand over the entire blade, causing it to glow blue. He looked at the bird with confidence as he swung his weapon, and then dealt a huge blow to it, causing the wind to follow the sword attack. A strong wind was coming from that place and a huge blue light was visible. At this place where the basilisk was flying, a long dent was formed in the ground, and the body of this attack was able to break in half. Panza watched this picture in horror and remained silent. A system window popped up notifying that the initial class enchantment skill had been obtained. The disappointment of the middle class was also received by him. He acquired a top-class enchanting skill. Yuri looked back at his blade in surprise and noticed that his sword had broken into several pieces. He looked at the remaining rusty iron and thought that he had succeeded in strengthening the sword, but the blade could not withstand this strengthening. Panza stood to the side and hummed, and Yuri turned around at his sounds. Panza shouted in horror that there was a monster in front of him. His whole body shook, and he ran further into the forest asking for help. Yuri watched all this in disbelief. Suddenly he caught up with him and asked him to wait, because he promised him. Panza looked at him in shock and repeated several times that he understood him. Just so he doesn't kill him. Lime looked at all this from the side and decided to run up to the body of the killed monster. It squeaked in confusion as it saw something sparkle next to the monster. It was a golden stone that shimmered in the sun. Panza decided to sum up their conversation and said that he says that he doesn't remember anything and he doesn't know what this place is, so he wants him to tell him everything. They sat on two logs opposite each other. Panza awkwardly said that he already thought that he was a demon in human form and had come to kill him. Yuri told him that he was not going to do anything like that, because he does not kill everyone who is friendly towards him. Panza said, but judging by everything that's happening, he really doesn't know anything. Yuri listened to him carefully. Panza folded his hands and put his head on it, starting to explain that this entire forest is filled with basilisk. His team went straight to this one's nest in pursuit of rare items, and then they abandoned him there so they could escape. Panza clenched his teeth desperately and said that he thought they were his friends. Yuri, sitting opposite, simply remained silent on this story, so Panza apologized for moving away from their topic. Yuri said that there was nothing wrong with that. Panza said that what is more important is that he killed that basilisk with one blow. He is clearly an unusual person. He stood up from the log and showed with a sign that it was cool. He said that he was definitely a great adventurer. Panza decided to ask him, does he want to go to the guild? Maybe someone there knows him? Yuri looked at him emotionlessly, then asked a question, adventurer? Panza began to explain to him with interest that these are people who make a living by performing various tasks that can be obtained in the Adventurers Guild. But he completely forgot that killing monsters, searching for rare items or rescuing a lost cat, it all depends on the rank of the task, so these can differ greatly from each other. About 20 kilometers from here in the southwest, in the trading town of Rydale, there is a guild. Yuri, with an emotionless expression on his face, thought an adventurer, because in his past life he had the same profession. These people do not depend on anyone, they do what they want. They can look for treasures, go fishing, and this is an ideal profession for the current one. Yuri stood up from the log and said that he would try to go to this guild, then he thanked him for the information. Panza made a happy noise. Yuri put his hand to his mouth thoughtfully and thought that 20 kilometers was a little far, if he had teleportation magic, or at least transport. Suddenly something came towards them from above, leaving a huge shadow on the ground. Panza, stunned, stood in a frightened pose and shouted, asking that this couldn't be happening? Above them was another basilisk. This one's eyes glowed with a bright yellow light. Panza nervously wondered, another basilisk? He ran screaming and ran further into the forest, saying that he was very scared. He needs to be saved. Yuri silently looked at the basilisk and remained in place. He looked back at the broken weapon and wondered in his head, how could this be? His sword is broken and now he has to fight using only magic? The basilisk sat on its paws right in front of Yuri, and this caused white feathers to fly. It opened its beak without making a sound, while Yuri watched its behavior in puzzlement. Suddenly the basilisk squeaked happily, and Yuri was surprised by this. He made this squeak. Yuri asked if he was Lime? Lime, who had turned into a huge basilisk, squeaked joyfully at his words, confirming his doubts. He squeaked again as a system window popped up in front of him, revealing that it was a slug in the form of a basilisk. The condition of this is that it has absorbed the magic stone basilisk. Yuri wondered about slime. Can lime change if it eats something? He told Lime that it had an interesting ability. Suddenly, Yuri had an epiphany and his eyes opened wide. He told this to wait a little and Lime squeaked in confirmation. A moment later they were in the sky together as Yuri sat on the basilisk. Yuri laughed and happily said that this was a lot of fun. He can already see Rydale. Lime squeaked in delight. They landed near the city and Yuri dismounted from Lime. Yuri thanked it for giving him a lift. Lime squeaked happily, as if accepting his gratitude. Lime walked up and put his hand to the basilisk's head and said, if Lime entered the city like this, they would attract too much attention, so he decided to say goodbye to him. Lime squeaked in confusion and did not understand this situation at all. Yuri walked towards the city waving after Lime and wishing this to be careful. Lime watched all this, and then suddenly a loud squeak was heard behind Yuri and a strong wind blew from the yellow ball. Yuri froze in place stunningly, then turned his head to look at what was behind him. He wondered what it was. Yuri noticed something jump into his clothing pocket. Lime fit into his clothing pocket and squeaked happily. Yuri asked, "Can Lime do this?" He exhaled and thought that Lime was still useful, while it was squeaking in his pocket. Yuri asked that Lime wants to go with him. Lime squeaked happily and very loudly in agreement. Yuri named it Lime. From now on it will be called Lime. Lime squeaked enthusiastically several times in response. Together they approached a huge building with a sharp roof. Yuri entered this building and approached the girl. He apologized and said that he wanted to become an adventurer. The girl asked him a question. This is his first time here, right? First, you need to tell him about his skills and past experience. Yuri looked at her puzzled and asked about his past experience. The girl smiled sweetly and explained that due to the fact that in the last few years the number of people wishing to join the guild had increased greatly, and now they were conducting a preliminary assessment of their candidates for joining this guild. He couldn't share current data about his abilities. Yuri remembered all the events happening to him and thought in his head that he could do this, talk about the experience from his previous life, but this was somehow wrong. After all, he was a magician, the best swordsman, and now he is a complete beginner who can do everything he did in past lives. Yuri put his hand behind his head and said in a relaxed manner that he had nothing special. The girl brought it with a smile. What in that case? Yuri no longer heard her and went to reason in his head that he had decided to become an adventurer. But if so, there was nothing he could do about it. Suddenly a person intervened in their dialogue and a question was heard from the side. Are there any problems? The girl called this man back as Mr. Galio. Yuri analyzed his personality and found out that his name is Galio Figars, he is from the human race, male, and his age reaches 41 years. Galio leaned closer to the girl and listened to her whisper as she tried to explain to him. After listening, he sighed heavily and tiredly. Galio agreed and told her to prepare one item. The girl bent down in front of him and said that she would listen to him. She then approached Yuri and asked him not to go anywhere. Galio closed one eye and reasoned in his head that they could lose their license if they accepted everyone, and there was no place for him here. He should lower his pride. Once everything was ready, Yuri was led to a strange machine and he wondered what it was in front of him. Galio explained that it was a magical power meter, and he only needed to give a little of his magical power, then the device would measure his potential. The girl behind him smiled sweetly. Galio said the conditions. If his potential is 30 units, he can consider himself passed. Now he can start executing. He stood aside with an evil smile and thought that a beginner would never be able to get 30 units, and if he realized his level, then he would give up immediately. It was heard from Yuri that he asked if he breaks this device, will this also be considered for successfully passing the exam? Yuri pointed his finger at the device and looked at them in confusion. The girl put her hands to her mouth in surprise, and Galio's face immediately changed to one of stunned expression. Galio burst into laughter and shouted that this was the first time he had met someone like him. He told him not to worry, because the meter's scale can reach up to 9,999, and with his powers, this device cannot break. Galio came very close to Yuri and looked into his eyes with a malicious smile. Yuri calmly wondered, how is this? Then he put his hand to the device and it activated. Suddenly, a strong magic enveloped his body while he thought that he was calm then. Magic filled the entire space, blowing away the girl and Galio. Galio asked, stunned, what is this? What's happening? The girl watched the scene in front of her with her mouth open. Galio counted the units that filled his magic. He said, 30 units, 40 units, 50 units. Then he asked in surprise, 60 units, 70 units? It will still increase. Yuri silently watched what was happening until the device shattered into sharp pieces of glass on all sides. Yuri ducked down so as not to fly away from that place. Galio sat and hiccuped angrily. Yuri apologized to him and asked him if that was enough. He still did not remove his hand with the device. Galio laughed nervously and said that there seemed to be some problems with this device. He wondered in surprise how this was possible. He had definitely deceived them. Yuri looked at him puzzled while Galio thought that this vile cheater needs to be taught a lesson. Galio's face changed into a sinister smile. He said since it was not possible to get an exact result, he would consider it passed. Yuri started asking, how? From the side it was heard that he was following them. Yuri thought that this grandfather was a very good person. After some time, they were in a large arena and Galio said that his exam would start in 3 minutes, so he should get ready. Yuri told him that he understood everything. After that, he began to look around and think in his head that there are so many people here, so perhaps it will be difficult for him. Voice questions were heard from the side. Is he worried? Yuri noticed this and looked at Anya. Anya shouted joyfully that he was passing this exam for the first time. He thought asking the question, what? She's so loud. Yuri analyzed who was in front of him, Aneta Phil from the human race, female. Her age was only 15 years. She put her hand to her chest and joyfully shouted, if he doesn't understand something, then let him ask her. This is her 7th time here. You can tell she's a veteran, so she knows everything here. Yuri asked her, puzzled, the 7th time? Has she tried to pass this exam so many times? This expression hit Anya right in the heart. Then she looked at him sadly with tears in her eyes and pursed her lips and said that it was not that much. A moment later, Anya sat a little to the side and drew a stick on the stone floor, saying that she was not that bad. Is there anything bad about the fact that she failed this exam a couple of times? Yuri watched this silently. Anya abruptly came closer to him and said in a whisper that she would tell him in confidence that since the exam began to be accepted by Galio, this difficulty has increased to its maximum. This man stood aside and smiled with all his teeth. He shouted that the exam for adventurers was declared open to him. Their first test is sword mastery. Galio pointed the weapon straight and shouted that the condition for passing this test was that they defeat him in a sword fight. The first test participant, number 1, he asked to come to the Johnny Slang Arena. With a grin, he began to take the blade out of the case and confidently said that now he would get to work. They faced each other and readied their weapons. Anya said joyfully, finally. From the side they shouted, fight. Then both sides attacked each other, and their blades met each other. They fought gracefully against each other, blocking and attacking. People from the sidelines shouted in surprise that Johnny was as powerful as Galio. Anya emotionally watched their fight, while Yuri thought in his head that they were approximately equal in strength. Johnny chuckled and sarcastically said that it turns out that Galio is not such a strong opponent. Galio's body was shaking and his smile was tense, he said as he knew it. His weapon began to cut through Johnny's blade. Johnny was surprised by what was happening. During this, Galio spoke abruptly, but he will not be able to defeat him. Johnny's weapon broke in half, and Galio's expression was insane. Johnny watched the piece of his weapon fly away in horror. He looked at the stone floor where a piece of his weapon lay and wanted to ask the question, why? But his speech was interrupted by the evil laughter of Galio, who put up his weapon directly and asked him in an ominous way, does he want to become an adventurer? Let him not make him laugh then, because first he needs to improve his basics. Galio burst into uncontrollable laughter, while Johnny said angrily, damn it. From the side of the people who watched this, the words came, as he thought, that the battle would take place without a chance, because this always happens. In the arena, Johnny picked up a piece of his weapon while Galio continued to grin at him. Yuri activated the skill of analysis, and in his head he understood. He analyzed the Galio sword which was called the shock sword, it was rated B, and the sword in Johnny's hands which was called the base sword, which was rated F. Yuri realized in his head that they had a difference in the quality of their weapons. Galio closed one eye and with an ominous smile, choosing the next opponent, saying what the next one would be. He challenged Aizawa Yuri to fight him. Anya looked at him in surprise while Yuri stood emotionless. Anya shouted out support, let's fight! Yuri thought and asked a question in his head, is it his turn yet? He would like to watch Galio's movements longer, but there is nothing he can do. Yuri began to pull out his weapon, but once he pulled it out, it was only a small piece of his former sword. All the people around were puzzled by his weapon, even Galio made a surprised sound. Yuri looked at his weapon and made an awkward sound when he discovered that only a small piece of the weapon remained. He put his finger to his cheek and looked at it thoughtfully. Yuri remembered that it was broken when he killed that basilisk. Galio made a short sound while Yuri looked at his weapon in concentration. Galio burst into laughter after a short time, opening his mouth very wide. He said what other weapon could a poor player like him have? If he wants to give up, then now is the time to do so, because it will be awkward for him to beat such a defenseless person. Galio held the weapon with both hands and looked straight at Yuri's confident stance. He prepared the weapon and held it out with a smile, saying that if he accidentally killed him, it would be bad for his reputation. Yuri continued to look at his weapon and wonder what he should do now. You can't fight with this sword. His gaze rose to Galio and he understood in his head that he had no choice and would have to deal with him with one blow. Yuri began to deny his proposal and suggested that they better start their fight. He stood up before the fight and said with confidence that he could handle it in just 1 second. Galio's eyes turned black with irritation. He began to attack him, shouting that he would not regret it. He was a damn boy. Galio swung his weapon and flew towards him, while Yuri stood still. Suddenly, time seemed to stop, the sword master skill was activated and Yuri in an instant was transported behind Galio using the skill, distance reduction. Yuri held the broken piece of his weapon to Galio's neck, who made a puzzled sound. Galio was completely tense and terrified as Yuri's cold-blooded gaze fixed on him. Anya surprisingly raised her hand to her mouth, and her face blushed across her cheeks. Yuri thought in his head that this technique allows him to use the perception gaps of his opponents to instantly move behind him. This is called distance reduction. When he was a sword master, he used this technique often, so it was good that he was able to use it successfully. Galio threw his weapon to the floor, and it shook on the ground for a while. He said that he was giving up, he lost. Now he has passed the exam. Many people clenched their fists, and shouted joyfully that he had won. Yuri was applauded by many people and congratulated him for this. He asked Galio, is he now officially an adventurer? But his body was obscured by something huge and from it one could hear that the exam was not over yet. Yuri looked up in surprise and in front of him stood a huge man who said that now he had to pass his magic exam. Yuri analyzed who was standing in front of him. His name was Pancho Panza, he was from the human race, male, and his age was 43 years old. Panza confidently placed his hands at his sides. Suddenly, a magical crystal appeared above the arena, in which a red ball was burning. People asked in surprise, what is this? Anya looked up in surprise and said, there is something in the sky. Yuri also looked up with everyone else. Panza stated the conditions for completing his task. They can only use magic and if they can destroy the target in the sky, then they passed. People continued to look up, puzzled. Yuri thought in his head and wondered if this is all they decided to do. He thought the task would be more difficult. The guy shouted out asking a question, is he talking about the target? It's too far. Never get into something like this. Anya put her hands to her face in surprise and continued to look up. Yuri was distracted by people's words without understanding them. Anya said with horror that she knew that no one would pass this exam. Yuri watched them puzzled and asked in his head, what's wrong with them? Isn't this target made of a special material? People shouted that they would try to get it. Someone used the skills Fireball, Wind Blade, Ice Needle, but none of their attacks reached the target or even traveled half the distance to the target. People, disappointed, said, damn it. They knew that they would not pass this task. Yuri watched their disappointment and asked in his mind, why is everyone using basic level magic? Maybe this is the only thing I can use? Panza asked what's wrong with him. Yuri looked up at him. Panza asked intimidatingly, where is he looking? He laughed very loudly and mockingly asked if he really didn't know magic. A person who decides to master one skill cannot master another. Panza continued that people who are not good at magic will never become adventurers. His laughter could be heard throughout the arena. Yuri didn't show any emotion. Panza said that no one of note showed up this time either. The people watched in horror and anger, as he horribly taunted them for not giving in. Unexpectedly for him, Yuri said, fireball and a fire magic ball began to form in his hand. Panza made a puzzled sound and quickly turned his attention to him. The fireball flew straight up with great force, blowing away everything on the ground. It began to reach his goal and the closer it came, the more it increased in size. When it hit its target, it turned into a huge explosion in the sky above the entire city. People shouted in confusion and asked questions, what? While their bodies were blown away by the strong wind. Anya covered her skirt and her head from this wind. Panza's face showed great surprise. The girl brought it with horror, the flames consuming everything, it's simply impossible. People wondered what this man with the legendary magic, Inferno, had forgotten here. They looked at Yuri, who confidently continued to stand and watched what was happening without expression on his face. Yuri thought in his head and wondered what she was talking about. He was now using a simple fireball. The fireball over the city began to develop with the wind and darken. This could be seen from afar. Someone in a black cloak watched the distant events in the city and said, "It seems that he has awakened." However, the current one is not ready yet. With a smile on his face, he said that one day they would meet again. May he not disappoint him then. After these words, he gradually disappeared from the rock-like smoke. Panza was lying on the ground motionless, and Yuri approached him. Crouching down, he called him back and asked if he passed the exam. Yuri is presented with a license card and congratulated on successfully passing the exam. Here's his license. He looks at it in surprise and takes it into his hands. The sweet girl said that all adventurers start with rank F. This rank will increase depending on his achievements or completed tasks. Yuri listened to her carefully. Suddenly, Anya jumped on him from the side, shouting that she had found him. Yuri managed to return his head in her direction and then deftly dodge. Anya fell to the floor and slid on it for a while, simultaneously making a sound of pain. The girl at the table pressed her hands to her face in surprise. Yuri said she is the girl from the exam. Anya laughed and said that she forgot to introduce herself to him. She put her hand to her chest and joyfully said that her name was Annetta Phil. But he can just call her Anya. She enthusiastically moved closer to him and enthusiastically asked him what his name was. Yuri slowly said his name. Anya shouted, "Yuri! He should take a look at this." She happily held her adventurer's license in her hands, with a rank of F. Anya said that after he left, a repeat exam was held and this time she was able to pass. Panza and Galio bowed to the players and another examiner began to examine the players while the previous examiners left the arena. Anya shouted that it was all thanks to him. She thanked him very much. Yuri said that he didn't have time to do anything. A group of people were watching them from the side and the man with the axe commented that it was very noisy in here. Another beefy guy said that these are just beginners, and they are already making so much noise. Both of these guys asked what does Zach think about this. Zach remained silent threateningly, and then said that he didn't like them. After some time, the sun rises above the tall buildings and it begins to illuminate the entire city. Yuri lazily pulled his body up and made sounds. He looked out the window and fell silent, wondering when was the last time he slept so well. In his previous life, all he did every day was fight various monsters. A lot happened yesterday. His thoughts were interrupted by a system window that suddenly popped up in front of his eyes. Yuri made a puzzled sound. In the system window it was written that the skill, attributeless magic, of the initial class had been obtained. Yuri asked again, puzzled, attributeless magic? He silently looked at the system window and thought that he had never heard of such a skill and he did not fully understand the meaning of this skill. Yuri continued to silently stare at the system window. After a couple of minutes, he raised his head up and tiredly said that let it be damned. He relaxed back into bed with a beautiful view outside the window. Yuri thought that he used the money he received from the guild to stay in this luxurious hotel, so he is going to sleep a little more. He remembers how a nice girl told him that he could borrow some pocket money from the guild, but he should try not to fall behind on his payments. Someone was running very quickly along the corridor, and then Anya ran into Yuri's room. She wished him an admiring good morning. Yuri's face contorted in despair. He said what she needed from him at this early time. Anya folded her hands contentedly and closed one eye. She chuckled and said that she really did. Suddenly her speech was cut off when she shouted in surprise, asking what kind of bed he had. Yuri was lying on Lime's enlarged body, but it didn't mind at all and squealed happily. Yuri got off Lime's body and explained that he didn't like the bed in his room, so Lime was able to help him. He thanked him. Anya rushed towards Lime and asked in admiration, "Is this a cute slug?" Yuri placed his hand on his body and confirmed her words. He didn't dare explain to her the whole story of how they met, so he told her that it was a long story, but this was his friend and his name was Lime. Lime squeaked happily in response. Anya enthusiastically put her hands to her mouth and said that even monsters obey Yuri, he can't be so cool. Yuri wondered, does she think so? Anya, puzzled, put her finger to her mouth and moved closer to Lime. It made a puzzled sound. Anya recalled Yuri. There was an expression of admiration on her face, and stars were shining in her eyes, and there was a blush on her cheeks. Anya asked if she could pet Lime. Yuri stood silently aside. Lime was surprised by her offer. Anya asked this question, is Lime against this? Lime squeaked happily. Anya lay down on this body and said in a relaxed manner how pleasant Lime is to the touch. Lime squeaked relaxedly in agreement. Yuri unhappily wondered, why did she come? Anya suddenly remembered and joyfully began to explain that she had come to convey something important. Their exam isn't over yet. Yuri asked what else does this mean? Anya began to tell him that in fact there is also a hidden exam. She talked about how first they need to successfully pass the exam, and then they become adventurers. But they also have to pass a hidden exam, and if they succeed, they will become real adventurers, and if they fail, their license will be taken away. Anya said that their licenses are only temporary at the moment, but if they don't pass this exam, it will be taken away from them. Yuri thoughtfully raised his hand to his face and said that everything was clear to him. He mused that he had worked so hard to become an adventurer, and would be sad if he lost his license. Yuri turned his head to Anya and said that he couldn't do anything about it, so he would go take this hidden exam. Anya said joyfully she knew that he would say this. Meanwhile, she was looking for something in her pocket. Anya then abruptly handed the piece of paper in front of his face and said loudly and enthusiastically that this is why she took the task in advance. She invited him to complete this task together. Yuri immediately refused her offer and she simply fell from shock. Anya took hold of his leg and, with tears in her eyes, asked him questions. Why doesn't he want to? He needs to agree. Yuri explained to her that he simply prefers to act alone. He looked down at her and thanked her for the offer, and then asked her to get to her feet. Anya's face was tear-stained and she plaintively called his name. She let go of his leg and Yuri silently walked to the door and then stopped. Anya looked at his back, puzzled. Yuri looked back at her and asked her, just about this topic, how should he accept the task? Anya cried out, wondering if he could really handle it alone. They should definitely go together, she's worried about him. Yuri said that she shouldn't worry, because he can handle it alone. Upset, Anya said that she needed him for this task. She explained in frustration that when she saw his abilities in the exam, she wanted to become an adventurer like him. Anya began to come closer to him, saying that this is why she wants to learn from him. She asked her to take him with him. Yuri thought for a couple of minutes that he definitely doesn't understand how everything works here yet, and he could use her help, and working together with Anya would be a good decision for him. He, in despair, agreed with her and said that they would go together. She enthusiastically asked him, "Is this true?" Then she thanked him profusely. Suddenly something dawned on Yuri. With a gloomy expression on his face, he said that he needed to change clothes, so he asked to wait for Anya downstairs. She loudly agreed with this proposal. Yuri transferred lime from his shoulder to his hand. As soon as Anya left, Yuri focused on one thing. He opened the window and looked out into the street. Yuri silently looked exactly at the clock tower, and then made a sign with his fingers, gun. He closed one eye and aimed his magic, a precise fireball. A small fireball began to form at the end of Yuri's arm. It flew across the entire street at high speed and flew straight into the clock tower, on which two silhouettes were visible. The two guys were stunned by what they saw. The fireball hit the building. This spoiled the guy's item they were looking for it from. The guys shouted, asking him, "Is he serious?" It hit the lens right. But they are 100 meters away from him. A curse. They need to leave now. They must report this to Mr. Zack. Yuri was stretching the hand he used to shoot and thought that someone was watching him. He wondered what all this was for. Did he ruin something for someone? Behind the door, the screams of Anya were heard, calling him back and asking, "Is he not ready yet?" Yuri said that he is already on his way. They went together to the forest, which was located between high mountains. Anya called Yuri away and beckoned him to come here to her. Yuri slowly followed her and thought that he was back in the forest. He reluctantly looked around the forest. Suddenly Yuri noticed two animals between the bushes. It turned out to be a white forest mouse, rank F, and a brown forest rabbit, rank F. Yuri hummed in confusion as he watched the rabbit. This, frightened, raised its ears and this, together with the mouse, ran away into the forest. Yuri watched this silently, and then he said that it was calmer here than he thought. Anya laughed and said that they were very lucky. Their task is to collect medicinal herbs, so there is no threat to their lives. She raised one finger up and closed one eye, with a joyful smile on her face, saying that this task was also quite popular among novice adventurers. To get this task, she had to stand in line all morning. Anya put her hands on her sides and beamed with pride. Yuri said this is how she took the task. He said in surprise that she was amazing, because she knew so much here. Anya looked at him amazingly and she, embarrassed, grabbed her head and blushed, telling him to stop, because he was flattering her. But however, she confirmed that there was some truth in his words. Anya suddenly became distracted and she hummed in confusion. Yuri began to walk along another path, looking back at Anya. Anya pointed to the opposite path and said that they needed to go to the northern forest, which was on that side. Yuri pointed his finger at the path he followed and asked her if there was any difference. Anya shouted that this is not the case at all. She emotionally wondered, does it matter? This path leads to the eastern forest. That place is considered cursed with a lot of strong monsters, so it's too dangerous there. There lived wolves, goblins, snakes, and other strong creatures that emanated a red aura. Anya grabbed his hand and ran with him along the opposite path, saying that they would go collect herbs in the northern forest, so he should just follow her. Yuri did not resist and simply thoughtfully put his hand to his mouth. He agreed with her and thought that maybe he woke up in the eastern forest, because if he thought about it, there were only high-ranking monsters there. Yuri said thoughtfully that he killed the basilisk yesterday. Anya waved her hand and said contentedly that this was a funny joke, but she wouldn't believe him. Suddenly she shouted, "This is the place. They're almost here." A bright light filled the path, anticipating their appearance in that place. Anya stopped, put her hand to her side and pointedly extended her hand forward, joyfully telling that this is a clearing for collecting medicinal herbs. But before their eyes there was an empty piece of land where grass used to grow. Yuri wondered which of these are medicinal herbs. Anya began to rush around the field and look for grass. She nervously asked, "Is this not the case? Where is it? How did this happen and why?" Yuri crossed his arms over his chest and said his guess was that someone had gotten ahead of them. Anya knelt on the ground and touched the former places where the grass was. She thought that they would be the first. A man came out to them from the side and the words were heard, "What a shame for newcomers." Yuri analyzed who was standing in front of him. The system window said that this is Zach Balbire from the human race, male, age 22. Zach stood next to his gang and said with satisfaction that they had already collected all the medicinal herbs in this area. Anya asked them a question, "Who are they?" Zach told her that they were older and they shouldn't strain themselves so much. He stepped forward closer to them. Yuri recalled that he had already seen them at the guild. Zach decided to sarcastically ask them, "Are their licenses temporary now? They can share herbs with them." He handed her a piece of medicinal herb. Anya was delighted and put both hands to her cheeks. She wondered in surprise, is this true? Zach asked them, did they think that they would not come to the aid of their colleagues in such a situation? Anya was touched by their behavior and began to cry. She said that they had met such kind adventurers and now they would never forget them. Anya began to thank them, holding out her hands for the medicinal herb. Suddenly Zach threw the grass on the floor and Anya opened her eyes wide in surprise. As soon as the plant fell, Zach stepped on it. Anya looked at everything that was happening in puzzlement and surprise. Zach asked her with a malicious smile, is this what she wanted to hear from him? He called her a non-entity. Anya looked down emotionlessly. Zach spread his lessons widely and laughed. He asked them, do they understand? To become a famous adventurer, you always need to be better than everyone else. Although how would some tramp know this? Yuri looked at him intently. Zach continued, and also the pathetic non-entity knows this, they will not become adventurers. Anya stood gloomily with her head down. Zach advised them to give up and go back to the village. His entire group of people burst into laughter that could be heard even after they walked away. Yuri thoughtfully put his hand to his face and thought that he sincerely wished them harm. He wondered if it was possible that those who had been watching him since the morning were in company with Zach? But how could he anger them? Suddenly he noticed Anya's body trembling. Sounds were heard from her side. Suddenly Anya angrily shouted after them that they were actually allowing it. She's actually offended. She clenched two fists and stood threateningly. Anya suddenly ran in the other direction shouting to Yuri that they had some more time. She suggested looking elsewhere for herbal remedies. Yuri began to think that if they don't do anything, their licenses will definitely be taken away. He continued to look at the sky and think about how big the forest was. Yuri realized that the two of them couldn't handle it, and they needed to find a solution. The lime in Yuri's pocket stirred and then jumped out happily. Yuri watched this in surprise. Lime jumped into his arms and Yuri asked what happened to Lime. Did he feed this recently? Lime jumped happily and squeaked very loudly. Suddenly he was able to convey the idea of this to Yuri, and it dawned on him. Yuri looked at him in surprise and thought that everything was clear to him now. Lime squeaked with a serious expression on his muzzle. Yuri raised his head up and extended his hand high. He said he's counting on Lime. Yuri threw Lime high into the sky and it squeaked joyfully. At first Lime was small in the sky, and then he grew many times larger and covered many trees with his shadow. It began to split into several pieces, and then scatter throughout the forest with great force. Anya watched what was happening in surprise. She dodged it and asked what was going on here. There's so much lime here. Yuri contentedly crossed his arms over his chest and explained to her that now we can say that they have already collected the herbs. Many parts of lime were jumping all over the forest, inspecting the grass and between the trees. After some time, several parts of lime brought a large stack of grass and it squeaked happily. Anya jumped for joy and said that there was so much grass. They collected such a large amount in just an hour. Yuri petted Lime and then praised it for doing a great job. Lime squeaked happily several times. Yuri said he thinks this is enough for them, so he suggests they return to the guild. Anya, who was standing aside, suddenly became sad. She began to leave them and apologize, telling them to return without her. Yuri asked her what happened. Anya turned and smiled sweetly, saying that she wanted to take a little walk in the forest, so she would walk back alone. Yuri looked at her emotionlessly. Anya stood among the trees saying that Yuri is very amazing. She started looking for something in her pocket. Anya pulled out the tattered grass from her pocket and looked at it sadly. She said that compared to him, she was a mediocre nonentity, and she would not become an adventurer. Anya looked at the leaf for a while, then squeezed it in her hands with great force. She thought that at this rate she would never become better than Yuri, and she needed to learn. Anya sharply pushed off with her foot and ran to the side. She jumped up into the trees and began to push off, quickly running through the forest. Anya thought that she needed to learn to cope on her own. She examined the territory while sitting on a tree branch, jumping onto other tree branches. She even found a nest with chicks and was touched by it. After some time, Anya sat on a tree branch and joyfully looked to the side. She made an excited sound. Anya shouted that she found it. In front of her was a clearing with medicinal herbs. She jumped from the tree right in front of the clearing and ran towards the medicinal herb. Anya said that she could become an adventurer, but suddenly something stopped her, catching her eye. In front of her was a white paw standing in front of her. It was an angry white wolf who growled menacingly at her. She was stunned and wondered, is this a wolf? Your rank monster? She's gone too far into the forest. Anya took a defensive stance, prepared her weapon and thought about what she should do, because she had to overcome this. Meanwhile, the wolf attacked her. Anya pointed the dagger at the wolf and began to doubt, because she is rank F. The formidable wolf stood right in front of her with flaming yellow eyes. She asked hesitantly, could she kill an E-rank monster? Anya stepped back a little and closed her eyes, realizing that she could not do this. Suddenly, an image of Yuri appeared in her mind, saying that she was amazing. Anya opened her eyes wide and stood back up in a confident stance. She said that she would stop relying on others. She's actually an adventurer. The white wolf was already close to her. Anya pointed the dagger at the beast and confidently said that she could handle it alone. A huge wolf attacked her from above, opening his mouth wide. She managed to defend herself from his attack with a dagger. A strong blow threw Anya into a tree. She sat up and looked tired. Anya said in her head, she is calm. She needs to watch the enemy's movements. There was pain in her eyes, and drops of sweat were running down her face. Suddenly the big wolf started attacking her again. Anya looked surprised, but managed to climb up the tree before she hit her head on the tree. As soon as the wolf hit his head, Anya was on a tree and ready her weapon. She jumped from the tree, swinging it. As she flew down, she screamed militantly. The white wolf looked at her and continued to growl. As soon as Anya reached the ground, she plunged her weapon straight into the head. The wolf fell to the ground dead while Anya tried to catch her breath. She said in surprise that she succeeded, she won. Tears flowed from Anya's face, and she loudly and enthusiastically shouted that she had won. Everyone who didn't believe was wrong. Before her feet lay a wolf with his tongue hanging out and a sword in his head. Suddenly, Anya froze in place while many yellow eyes appeared behind her in the shadows of the forest. A huge pack of wolves looked at her from afar. Anya looked back at this in horror and said that this couldn't happen. She was surrounded by a pack of wolves on all sides, and Anya wondered if this wolf was not alone here. Several wolves immediately pounced in her direction. She watched in horror as these ran up to her. Because of this, Anya closed her eyes, preparing for the worst. Suddenly Yuri ran across the entire clearing, ran into Anya's arms and stopped not far from the wolves. Anya, with tears in her eyes, looked at Yuri in surprise and asked, is it him? Yuri looked ahead emotionlessly for a moment, then he told her that he would deal with it. He released her to the ground, carefully observing the behavior of the wolves. Anya asked him what he was doing here. Yuri watched her out of the corner of his eye. He returned to her and said that without her he would not have been able to find these medicinal herbs, and he simply could not give them away alone. He decided to follow her, secretly watching from the side. He saw how she fought with that wolf, and it was a great fight. Anya was surprised by his words, so her cheeks turned pink, and she smiled faintly. Meanwhile, drool was flowing from the wolves' mouths, barking and growling menacingly. They all attacked them at once. Yuri stood emotionlessly in thought when he drank water at the hotel yesterday. He learned water magic. A system window popped up in front of him and notified him that the initial class water magic skill had been obtained. He acquired a middle class water magic skill. Water magic, top grade, was obtained. Yuri decided to test this skill. His hands lit up with a blue aura. Yuri apologized to Anya and said that he would quickly sort it out. His hand gathered water magic, forming a magical water ball between his hands. Yuri said, "Water magic. Tornado." A large water tornado captured the wolves' bodies and swirled around it. After this skill, the wolves were thrown aside, and one of these flew into a tree. It quickly came to consciousness, and they were already growling menacingly, looking at them again. Yuri thought he was able to stop them, but the damage from this magic is not enough to kill it. Several wolves immediately pounced back on Yuri. He thought it was time for him to warm up a little, and grabbed the dagger and began to pull it out. Yuri instantly cut the wolves' bodies, and there were sharp ice spikes around him. He used high water magic and looked at the wolves with cold blood. In Yuri's hands was an ice sword consisting of sharp pieces of ice. He stood in a special position and prepared for the attack. At the same time, 3 wolves ran towards him, and Yuri swung his weapon. He stabbed it into the ground, and icy sharp spikes formed around Yuri. On these spikes lay the bodies of a defeated pack of wolves. Anya watched the battle in shock. She lightly covered her mouth with her hands and said enthusiastically, as expected to see this from him. Anya immediately concentrated and thought, but even with such a strong attack there are too many of them. Yuri fought the wolf while more wolves emerged from the forest. When he kills one, another appears. Yuri looked back into the forest, which was filled with yellow eyes peeking out from the shadows. Anya shouted to Yuri that the pack of wolves follows the orders of the leader. This leader is somewhere in this forest. Yuri said that everything was clear to him, which means he needs to kill this leader. Suddenly, Lime squeaked in his head. He opened his eyes in surprise and wondered what happened. Lime beeped loudly in his head several times. Yuri raised his head and closed his eyes. He asked, "Does he see through Lime's eyes? Can the taming skill do this?" He saw a large white wolf lying on a stone, and then he sniffed it with his nose. Yuri saw that in front of his eyes was a silver wolf with AC rank. The white wolf, which had 3 eyes, growled while looking to the side. Yuri had a relaxed smile on his face and praised Lime. Lime squeaked confidently with a serious expression on his face. Yuri jumped off the ground and the wolf watched him in surprise. He jumped over the bodies of the wolves and Yuri, looking back, made a sign from his fingers, a pistol, and used an accurate fireball. It flew into the forest, flying through the trees towards the leader of the wolves. The silver wolf, noticing this, managed to move away from the place where the fireball hit. It looked at the smoking place and growled fiercely. Yuri said that everything was clear to him. There are too many covers here, and it will be difficult to hit this. He landed on his feet and thought that in this case. He extended his hand forward and a fireball began to form. Fire magic came from all over the forest, and it gathered into a huge ball. A pack of wolves watched what was happening in shock. Anya asked Yuri, "What is he doing?" Yuri, with confidence in his eyes, ordered Lime to leave that place. Lime instantly tree-hopped several trees and squealed. Yuri used high fire magic and sent a firestorm to the side. The fire completely burned forest trees and grass. This reached the silver wolf and it only managed to twist its muzzle angrily. A huge cloud of gray smoke emerged from that place. The silver wolf turned to ash, and only white teeth remained from its body. The incinerated body fell to the ground. Anya was too surprised by what she saw and stuttered. She asked loudly what just happened. In front of them there was a strip of burnt trees and grass. Yuri looked at her puzzled and said that he was just using fire magic. He asked her if this was an extraordinary spell. Anya shouted, "This is far from ordinary magic." In the place where the silver wolf died lay a magic stone. The system window prompted that there was an attribute-free magic stone, small in size, and rank E. This is a stone that contains attribute-free magic. Also, The next system window prompted something like a windy magic stone, medium in size, with rank C. This is a stone that contains windy magic. Anya emotionlessly called Yuri away and said how good it was that they had collected so many items. In front of them was a whole mountain of medicinal herb with rank F. This is the main ingredient of the restoration potion. Anya asked how they could carry such a large pile of medicinal herbs. Yuri thoughtfully put his hand to his chin and reasoned that she was right. It would be difficult for the two of them to carry it away. If only he had magic that could move everything at once. Suddenly, he was distracted from his reasoning by a system window in which it was written that the skill of attributeless magic, middle class, had been obtained. An idea came to Yuri and he said in his head, "This is it." After a while, they returned to the Adventurers Guild again. At the guild, Anya placed a stone in front of them and enthusiastically asked them to look at it, pointing with her hands. The girl enthusiastically covered her mouth with her hands and said, "This is a magic stone." She asked, stunned, "Did Anya kill the wolf?" Anya proudly put her hands on her sides and confirmed her words. The girl with glasses expressed her surprise, because on her first mission she defeated a monster with rank E. Anya giggled and proudly agreed with her words. The girl adjusted her glasses and said that she didn't need to think, and now she was officially looking for F-rank adventures. She congratulated her. Anya's face turned red and she enthusiastically raised her hands to her face. Anya started jumping with happiness and shouting that she had succeeded. Yuri praised her. Then the girl with glasses looked carefully at her notebook and invited the next Yuri. He thought that now it was his turn. The girl wondered why he came and didn't bring anything. Was he really that unlucky? Yuri asked her to wait a little, because he will show everything now. The girl put her finger to her mouth, puzzled, and looked at him. Yuri extended his hand to the side and used middle-class attributeless magic. There was a curvature of space and a large pile of medicinal herbs that they had collected in the forest appeared from the portal. The girl's glasses slightly fell off and she loudly asked, "What? Where does he get so many medicinal herbs from? How did he even get all this?" Non-attributed magic is magic that allows you to freely manipulate space, that is, cause the curvature of space. He simply moved a bunch from the forest to the guild. Yuri wondered that he possesses such useful magic. At the moment when he received another ability, he had guesses, but he does not understand how exactly he learned attributeless magic. Most likely it has something to do with the time spent in this place. Several people approached the heap of grass and said in surprise how much medicinal herb there was. What should they do with so much? An elderly man noticed a shiny green stone among the grass. His face twisted in surprise and he said this. The elderly man picked up the stone and wondered loudly, "Is this a wind magic stone? Does this stone contain magic? In which place? This magic stone only drops from one monster." All three people turned to Yuri and said that this couldn't happen. They asked him, "Did he kill the silver wolf?" Yuri emotionally agreed with their words and wondered if it was impossible to kill it. The two boys looked at each other in shock while the older man stood in silent shock. This man asked him not to go anywhere. Yuri silently observed this situation. Anya, who supported him, told him not to worry. He will definitely become an adventurer. Yuri said that it would be good. After a while they are at the wall and Anya tiredly said how long it took them. Something caught their attention and they looked at it. The elderly man, out of breath, apologized to them for keeping them waiting. He said that there would be one exception for Yuri and he would be promoted straight to B rank. Anya jumped enthusiastically behind him and shouted congratulations to him. Because he was so suddenly given such a high rank, he is very cool. The crowd wondered in surprise, did the newcomers get it? Did they hear it? The elderly man said that they are promoting him to B rank. The man said that such people are always welcome in their guild and all he had to do was fill out some documents. Suddenly Yuri refused to do this, because he was already feeling good. He asked if he could remain an F-rank adventurer. A group of people and Anya froze in place and asked in surprise what? Then they wondered out loud what he chose. They left the guild building and Anya kept asking Yuri if he was sure of his choice. The same chance occurs very rarely. Yuri looked at her in surprise and then confirmed her doubts, because all of this was somehow too complicated. Anya quickly said that if you increase your rank, there will be more requests from the guild. Yuri stretched his hands and said that she already understood this. That's what he thought when he remembered the past. Anya spoke uncertainly, but Yuri stopped her and expressed his wish that he wants to live freely, and he is also glad that he and she are of the same rank. Anya stood behind him and said that she never ceases to admire him. She will never be the same as him, she is not at all like him. She somehow got rid of the wolf, but when a whole flock circled her, she couldn't do anything about him. Yuri looked back at her, as she stood and said all this upset. He called her by name, and said that she had something that he did not have. Without her help, taking the task and explaining how to do it, he definitely would not have passed this exam. Yuri said that he already said that she is amazing. Anya froze in place, amazed by his words, and a blush appeared on her face. She ran forward, jumping and thanking him very much. Anya said that she will try with all her might to catch up with him. Yuri said that there is a long way to go. Anya asked in fear, did he decide to say so directly right away? Around the corner of the building stood a man in black clothes. It was Zack, who spoke angrily, if not for Aizawa Yuri. He suddenly pointed his finger at the sitting man and asked him, can he handle him? The dark silhouette of a man agreed with his words. He was wearing a clown mask and told Zack to trust him.